Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cheryl, and today I'm here to bring you a video that is just a discussion because you guys know I like my discussion videos, and that is sex in YA. Ow, controversial, I know. It seems that every time a book comes out, a popular book, especially if it's YA, obviously if it's YA, that's the point of this video, and people read it and they're like, this is fantastic, and then they realize there's sex in it, there's always a huge controversy surrounding that. For example, when the sex appeared as graphically and frequently as it did in this book, people were like, what the hell? Especially because prior to this book, there really wasn't that much sex. It might have been implied, but it wasn't explicit. I'm sure that there are quite a few more that I can list that fall into this category of being shocking. And so the question I'm bringing up today is, should a book be considered adult if it has sex in it, even if the protagonists are 16 through 19? And I don't think so. I think it should still be YA because that is the age of the protagonist, that is the age of the market they are appealing to. Thing is, I get it. Not everyone likes sex. Not everyone wants to read about sex. And there's a difference between vaguely hinting that a couple characters got it on versus an explicit sex scene. I get it, there's a difference. That is why when I do videos and I talk about books that have sex in them, I do make sure to explicitly state, this book has pretty explicit sex scenes in it. If you're not comfortable with it, avoid picking it up. And that is something that, as a reader, I think you should be vigilant of. If that is something that really bothers you in a book, then you should kind of do your best, if you want to know about the book beforehand, to figure out if that is something that's going to be in the book, and then if it is, you can avoid it. I don't think that people should be like, I'm uncomfortable with sex in books, so I'm going to police books and be like, you can't have sex in your book and consider it YA because I don't like it. And I get there's a difference between books that are geared towards 13-year-olds, especially with young protagonists, don't agree that they should be having sex, but 19-year-old characters, it's still YA most of the time, and that's where when people are like, nope, they shouldn't be having sex, that the line gets kind of gray and fuzzy, I think. And another thing I've noticed is that a lot of people who are raising arms about oh my god, books shouldn't have sex in them and be YA, don't really care or don't get nearly as upset if the books have swearing and explicit violence in them. For example, the Throne of Glass series, there is, not in the first book, she doesn't actually kill anyone in the first book, but there is pretty explicit violence in the later books, and people were not, at all upset about that. So people have become, I guess, desensitized enough to violence, but not to sex. But heavy violence is traditionally been something that has increased a rating on a video game or in a book. If there was explicit violence, people were like, hey, watch out, explicit violence, maybe it's not YA, maybe it's adult. Like I said, a video game would have explicit violence in it, and it would go from being rated T for teen to being rated M for mature, even if there wasn't sex in it, if there was that violence. And so people don't really care when there's violence in these fantasy YA books or just in YA books, but they care when there's sex, and I don't get it. I don't know where that disconnect is. I think it's because there's also different ranks to that. Like I said, there can be very general, ooh, did they do it? Maybe they didn't, and there's explicit sex scenes, and there's also vague, violence, and then there's also, explicit violence and gore. Those are two different things, and I get that. However, I've seen people completely upset at just the mention of there being sex in YA, and that's more what this video is about. Not necessarily talking about the difference in the value between a vague sex scene and an explicit one. I'm not here to do that. I'm just here to talk about the fact that sex in YA is considered controversial. So my biggest point, and the reason why I think that sex should be in YA, even if it's just vague and people shouldn't get up in arms about it, is because teenagers have sex. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Whether you like it or not, teenagers are having sex. And so it makes sense for books that are depicting realistic teenagers that they would be having sex. And it's been proven that abstinence education doesn't work. So having characters who abstain from sex and who are morally perfect and all of that kind of stuff, I don't think it's not a real reflection of teenagers. I don't think teenagers are inherently bad because they have sex. What these books and these authors have an opportunity to do is to provide sex education that many of these teenagers who are reading these books probably are lacking. I went through public school, and in the state I went to public high school in, is definitely in the Bible Belt. And while we were not preached abstinence only because it was a public school, it was heavily implied that obviously the best form of birth control is to not have sex. However, like I said, that's not realistic. Teenagers were still having sex. We still had people in my high school getting pregnant and people having sex with some frequency. It happens regardless of your beliefs on it, regardless of if you want it or not. It is happening. And the sex education system, just in general, in most public schools, is pretty shitty. Even if they aren't preaching abstinence only, like they might cover like the basics of how to have sex, what do the different organs mean, what do they do. They talk about that stuff, but they don't really like talk about like various birth control options, consent, and all of this kind of thing. And I feel like authors who are writing books geared towards these younger audiences have an opportunity to provide that education that may be lacking in their life, especially because they may come from like a super conservative family who these things are not talked about whatsoever. It is not talked about sex. It is not you do not talk about birth control or any of these things. If a book offers education on this kind of thing, I feel like that's invaluable because, like I said, these kids, these teenagers, I should say teenagers, not kids, these teenagers are able to get something that they may be lacking in their regular life. Do I think that means every YA author needs to put an explicit sex scene in? No, not at all. What I'm saying is an author can really use this opportunity to talk about why condoms are important, why birth control is important with whatever form, the fact that consent needs to be explicitly spoken, and that if consent is revoked at any point during sex, that it needs to stop 100% immediately, that consent is sexy. Consent is super important. I feel like authors have an opportunity to talk about these things that maybe aren't talked about that much. In fact, a lot of teenagers might not realize that not saying yes is the same thing as saying no. So if someone is silent during sex, that is not equal to yes. That is equal to no. So I'm getting rambly here. But basically the point of this rambly video is to say, can we please stop trying to police what are in books? And I feel kind of like a hypocrite saying that because I've gone on rants about books and just how terrible they are because they're misogynistic and sexist and all of these things. At the same time, that's different than you shouldn't have sex in your YA book because teenagers are going to read it. But good. I'm glad, because if I had the sex education when I was younger, I'm sure it would have benefited me in the long run. Like I said, I'm sure it probably would have benefited quite a few teenagers because, like I said, the sex education system in America is pretty fucking ridiculous. And if someone comes from a conservative home where there isn't the talk and there isn't any education on that front, maybe the only education they're gonna get is through media, through books, through TV shows. And when TV shows and books show that, you know, it's safe, it is good, safe sex to use a condom or to have some other form of birth control, and consent is sexy. And when it shows and like imparts these lessons, even if they are minor, even if it's just a very minor scene in the book, I think it's important. Moral of the story is, or long story short, teenagers are going to be having sex regardless if you agree with it, regardless of if you want it to happen or not. And if you are not comfortable reading a book that has 19-year-old protagonist, 18-year-old protagonist having sex, that's perfectly fine. I get you. Just don't read the book then. Don't rail on the author and say that sex has no place in YA, because it's a teaching tool just the way anything else is. Especially if you have no problem with violence in books, then I think it's just hypocritical. But that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments down below what are your opinions on this topic. I know, like I said, this topic gets kind of controversial, and especially as various beliefs are put in. And it just seems like every time a new book comes out that has sex, whether it's explicit or not, everyone just gets up in arms, and there's just, like everything else on book Twitter, everyone has different opinions and they like to yell at each other about them. So let me know some of your opinions, but let's keep it nice and cordial down in the comments. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on all of my social media, which is always linked down below. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!